I remember clearly when I must have been, 10 years old, we just moved down to Cape Town from Johannesburg. And on a Friday afternoon, my father used to pick me up from school, and I used to go around stores with him. And I used to then just go and work in the stores. Absolute slave labor. I was never paid in those days. But I was packing shelves, I was sweeping floors, I was packing on the tills. And I went through most of my school career actually working within the stores, and I must say eventually I started getting paid, and I earned myself a nice little bit of money. It was a good vac job. But there are a couple of really key points that stood out in my life in terms of the working experience, and I think it stood me in very good stead in terms of how I became a manager into the future. The first one was, I must have been 16, and we had our store, as I mentioned earlier, in Plumstead, and we had our Plumstead store, and I was working on the fruit and veg department. And one day the store manager came in and said to me, "The fruit and veg manager's left, you're it." Now here I am 16, been working for a week, and put as department manager. But I remember very clearly at the time thinking, this is not right. You know, you've got a guy who's a supervisor who's been working in the store for 5 years. You've got a whole team of people who are working in that department, and they actually know what they're doing. I had no idea what I was doing. And so the first thing I did was I called the supervisor and said, "Listen, I don't know why I'm the manager and you're not, but you've got to help me. We've got to make sure that this thing works properly." And I think that was the first learning. One was the inequity of the current South African situation, but also the value of education, the value of almost being in the right place at the right time and getting it done. And one thing that I learned, I think, at that stage was that nepotism is a bad thing. You know, you can't just get a job because you happen to have the right name. You actually have to know what you're doing. You have to have had that experience. And I think that, to me, was one of the most important learnings of that particular incident. The second one that really stands out for me was in my matric year at school in 1975. Pick n Pay opened the first hypermarket in South Africa. And you've got to look at it from two things. One was, here's a chain with a couple of stores around the country, relatively small business against some of the big majors. And they decided to totally reinvent the industry and made a huge investment into something that's very few of them existed in the world. And so this huge store in Boksburg was built way out in the middle of a field near the airport. And if you look at that area today, it's just a huge built-up shopping center, all as a result of that investment. But I remember that first day of that store opened so clearly. You know, Pick n Pay had been a food business, so we had to employ clothing people and general merchandise people for the first time. And the queues outside the store, and having to have bomb scares that day, and we had to have reverse shopping. So it's far more difficult to reverse shop than to shop. And that is when you have a bomb scare and everybody evacuates, they don't come back and ring up all their groceries. So you've got to unpack all those baskets and put the stuff back on the shelf. And you've got milk leaking and chilled product getting warm, and you know, obviously the losses, but we worked for hours trying to do that. But Pick n Pay was a self-service business as a supermarket. But what we didn't realize that you needed sales people to sell fridges and freezers. And on day one in that business, I became the Pick n Pay expert on selling box freezers. I didn't even know what one was before the beginning of the day, but you know, that was sort of the next business lesson that I learned, which was, don't assume things that they're going to be the way you want them to be. And if you're going to be planning, you're going to be in business, you need to look particularly for the unintended consequences of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. Because the unintended consequences are always the ones that will bite you. And if you can't think laterally, and if you can't look at things from multiple perspectives, you're actually not going to be able to succeed in trying to achieve what you want to achieve. So the next one when I went to university was I ended up running the UCT RAG. And that year we actually changed it from being a student fun thing to actually making serious money. And we made some very serious money the year I ran RAG. And we did it a couple of ways. For me, there were a couple of learnings that came out of that. The first one was, if you're going to rely on purely the fun activities, you're never going to make the money. The second thing was, how do you motivate people who are not paying to actually work and enjoy the journey? And the third one is, how do you focus on the activities that are actually going to help you make the money? So what we did was we got lots of beer from SA breweries, and we had a lot of student events, and at that point we would recruit the students to come and do the work that we needed them to do, and it all worked. But we also had to then take a very business-like approach. Now, I decided to play on, in inverted commas, the game within business. The RAG magazine had never had an advert on before, and I said, well, let's see if we can get a lot of money for the RAG magazine. Now, Pick n Pay had always been sponsoring it. My father was very keen on sponsoring RAG because he felt you investing in the next generation of shoppers. And he said that he wanted the right of first refusal on the cover if we ever advertised. So I took it to him and he made me an offer, and I remember the figure of 5,000 Rand, which was a lot of money in 1980s, early 80s. And I said, not good enough. So he says, well, we've supported you for years, that's what we're giving you. So I then took it out to tender, and I went to Jack Golden. And I got Clicks to pay for it, and they paid exactly double what Pick n Pay was prepared to pay. And my father, to this day, has still not forgiven me for that. But you notice the power of, what are you trying to do? We hear you're trying to do something for the greater good, to raise money, to try and help uplift society. Now, do you look at giving something to someone who's a family member in this particular case, or would you try and get the maximum? So it always becomes a toss-up between profit maximization and loyalty and looking after what you're trying to do. But I've always used a business principle of the North Star. And there's a guy called Mike Lipkin who wrote these number of books. I think he lives in Canada now, and he used the North Star concept very effectively. And the North Star concept is that you've got your North Star that sits up there. And how you get there is not linear. You can go left, you can go right, you can go forward, you can go backwards. But as long as you keep your objective in mind, you actually can get to the end and achieve it. But if you try and take a linear approach to these things, it actually never actually works. And I think that sort of was one of the key lessons that I got out of that. And as a result, I've done a lot of stuff in my life around that, knowing where I want to ultimately get to. But I go in multiple directions to get there. For me, the RAG experience was really the best business training I could get. I learned more from RAG at university than I probably did in my university courses. At the same time, I was on the SRC, and I learned how to deal with politicians. It was a fascinating time to be on the SRC at UCT in the early 80s. And some of the courses I did, which I found to be extremely valuable, and I didn't focus on business courses, I did a humanities degree, which today would be a PPE. And one of the courses that stood me the best stead was a course called African Economic History. And African economic history in the day was a detailed analysis of Marxist economics, which was totally banned in South Africa at the time. So we studied Marxist economics. And it stood me in great stead when I actually got into the Pick n Pay business, because one of my key jobs in the early years was doing our negotiations with the unions. And we could actually talk the same language, I think in many cases to their absolute frustration. But I understood where they were coming from, which they don't like management to understand. But I think it was valuable and helped us get into a good space. But after I finished at UCT, I was always interested in the business, and I always thought that I would want to go into the supermarketing business. And my father got me a job because he was involved with the CIS, the International Consumer Goods Forum. And he got me an internship with a company in Florida, in the USA. And I went there for a 3-month internship and went through the business. And the first thing, I asked him why he wanted me to go there. And he said, well, this company has just come out of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was at the time the largest bankruptcy ever in the United States, and it just reorganized and was coming out. Anyway, I just found it really strange being down in South Florida, and I was told that I need to wear a 3-piece suit to work every day. And to them, more important than how you make the stores operate was the fact that you had to wear a 3-piece suit. And it's hot and sweaty and clammy, and you're wearing sunglasses and you get out the car and your glasses fog up. It was all of that. I was then offered a job after the 3 months, and I stayed there for 2 years. And the job I was offered was designing and installing scanning and labor scheduling systems. Now, this was in 1981-82. It was way, way before scanning was going anywhere in the world. So this was pretty much cutting edge stuff. And I must say, I could never persuade Pick n Pay to do it when I got back, even when I was the managing director of the business. And only today, nearly 35 years later, they're starting to get into the concept of what we were doing in the early 80s in America. This company never lasted. It was eventually bought out. And it became the start of the whole industry of the leveraged buyout companies, which proliferated in the 80s and 90s within the US. But anyway, the key reason I decided to come back to South Africa was went into one of the stores one day. It was just after Jewish New Year. And this store was way down on the border between Miami and Fort Lauderdale. And the community was Hispanic and black. And the store was full of Jewish holiday merchandise. So I went back and I asked why. And they said, well, that's the planogram that we'd been given. So I went back and I looked at the census data for 1970, and it showed that to be a primarily Jewish area. I went to the 1980 census area and showed that the whole demographics had changed, and it was now Hispanic and black. And so I said to them, the president of the company, or the CEO, I said, come with me. I took him down there, I showed him this thing, and I said, look, this is totally out of line. We're never going to get these stores right if you're working on planograms that are 10 years out of date. So he said, very, very valid point. What would you do about it? So I said, well, very simply, I would get the buyers down here, show them what they're doing. I would change your regional manager and instead of having an old Jewish guy being the regional manager, put a guy who comes from the community in. Anyway, they did that. 3 weeks later, the store was changed. And turnovers went up threefold, literally overnight. So I was offered the job as vice president. So I thought, if a company's going to take a guy sort of 12 months out of university, give them the vice president's job in terms of marketing, this company's not going to be around. So anyway, at the same time, Pick n Pay offered me the job to go and be the operations manager to help set up our first venture into Australia. So I took that, left them, came back, and then went to Australia. Pick n Pay's had 2 experiences in Australia. And unfortunately, neither of them ended very well. The first one, we went in the early 80s, and the Rubicon speech absolutely destroyed our business. So we opened a hypermarket in Brisbane. It was an absolute runaway success. It was the biggest retailer in Australia overnight. And we had an additional 2 stores planned, one in Melbourne and one in Sydney, and the idea was to roll out about 10 hypermarkets across Australia in 10 years. My wife and I, we just got married, and we sold our house in Brisbane, and we were moving down to Melbourne to open the second store. And the unions started getting difficult with us. They'd put a black ban on the site. They refused to connect water. And I remember very clearly sitting down with my father at the time, myself, our general manager at the time, and we sat down. There was a table. So we were on the one side, the Australian unions were on the other side. On the right-hand side was the ANC, and on the left-hand side was SWAPO, because this was before Namibian independence. And they both said, we recognize what Pick n Pay's done. You've done a fantastic company. You're doing great stuff for the people and for the change in South Africa. But we've got a global sanctions policy. And the more we encourage people like you, the less chance we are going to get change in South Africa and independence for Namibia. So we're not lifting the ban. Eventually we had to sell our business in Australia, and my wife and I came to South Africa. It was very unusual for people to be coming this way in 87, 88. Everybody was going the other way. But anyway, we came back, made our life in Johannesburg. Our kids were born there, and then eventually we moved down to Cape Town. The second incident into Australia was we bought a business called Franklin's. Must have been about 15 years ago now, if not longer. And Franklin's was a big chain and effectively was going bust in Australia. We bought a piece of it plus the name in New South Wales. And we started growing the business. We were doing okay because Woolworths was doing well. Coles was really struggling in Australia, and there was no other opposition. What our management team at the time chose to ignore was that Aldi was setting up a shop in Sydney and started putting stores virtually next door to all of our stores. So we ended up in a bit of a price war with Aldi, which is never a nice place to be. At the same time, Coles got themselves reorganized. So we found ourselves in a huge squeeze, competitive squeeze, with the two bigger guys fighting each other and us being squeezed between Aldi and the big supermarkets. And a couple of lessons I learned, we eventually exited, and a couple of lessons I learned out of it was, firstly, Australia is a country that is operated on duopolies. Not legal duopolies, but it operates on duopolies. It's not a big enough country to really have broad competition. And unless you are number one or number two in virtually any industry, it's going to be really tough. The second issue was you don't want to get yourself caught in retail, stuck between a deep discounter and a very successful big guy, because you just can't compete, you can't have the margin. And we were limited to an area. We didn't move outside a particular area. So if we'd listened to my father's advice of the early 60s when he jumped Pick n Pay from Cape Town initially into Port Elizabeth and then into Johannesburg to be able to compete against the Checkers and OK in the day, we would probably have been okay in Australia. But we limited ourselves to New South Wales, which was a part of the country which wasn't growing. It wasn't getting big economic growth. It was over competitive, and we didn't jump into the areas where the growth was happening and to take the battle to somebody else. So you need to be in business. You need to actually be proactive. You need to say, where do I fight my battles? Eventually we sold it. We got out well, fortunately, and came back. But the second learning was the day I took over as chairman of Pick n Pay, I got on a plane and put the company on the block, put Australia on the block. You know, my father wasn't happy with me at the time. I think the board said, what are you doing? But we were running out of cash here. We needed the cash and the capital to expand. We'd run out of strategy here because we were constrained because of the amount of capital we had tied up there, which wasn't performing. So the best thing we could do was to actually release that capital, which we then brought back here and invested in the business. So I think the other lesson there was, get out in time. Don't wait for too long if something's causing problems or you think you're going to keep getting it right. And I've learned that over the years. So in about 1998, 1999, for a whole lot of reasons, I decided to take a sabbatical. I went off and I did some postgraduate work at Oxford and stepped out of operation at Pick n Pay. I became a non-executive director, chairman of the holding company, and set up and ran the family business outside Pick n Pay, the investment business, which I continue to do to this day. But during that time, I did a lot of work around business thinking and business strategy and studying concepts such as systems thinking, complexity theory, and trying to find ways of bringing that into the business, because everything was changing in South Africa at the time. We had the political change, the economic changes, the technology changes. And in my view, that the company had stagnated in terms of strategy. We were locked in an old paradigm. Our competitors were changing dramatically from store delivery to centralization, and we hadn't jumped fast enough into those spaces. We were moving there, but we hadn't jumped fast enough. And when I came back in as chairman, when my father retired, I think one of the key drivers was around this business strategy change, because we'd gone from being number one to number two. Our competitors were eating us. We couldn't compete with them to the extent. So we had to reignite our thinking, our strategy, move to pick and pay to one company as opposed to a decentralized business, make it very centralized, and reinforce the core values of consumer sovereignty, business efficiency, and doing good is good business. And I felt that if we re-energized that and balanced it, I think we could turn the business around. So pressed a button on centralizing, pressed a button on technology, on distribution, all of that stuff, and put it all in place at the same time. I think in retrospect I probably did too much at once, but we had to do it, and we did it. And I then brought in a new CEO in the form of Richard Brasher, whose mandate from the board was, this is the strategy we're on, make it work. And he spent the last 5 years or so making it work, which I think we are pretty much there now. This enabled me then to start moving into sort of other areas where I was particularly interested. I became the chairman of the International Consumer Goods Forum, and more recently the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa. And part of what I did it for was to help keep our business on the stage, international stage, and relevant, and to be able to get involved and to understand what's happening in the industry. But also because we as a company have been quite passionate about societal and environmental issues for many, many years. And CGF, Consumer Goods Forum, has got a very strong agenda around sustainability, deforestation, those areas. And we felt it was cool for our business to actually do that. Because some of the challenges facing us in this country are around poverty alleviation. And we do our best in that area through job creation. And we're very proud of probably being one of the biggest employers in this country. In South Africa, I think we've got about 85,000 people directly employed by ourselves and our franchisees, and about 1 million people who are dependent on the pick and pay system for their daily bread. But if you look at countries like Zimbabwe and Zambia, where we are the same thing, the biggest employers in some of those countries. And the difference that we make through employment is part of our ethics in paying people well. But there is the other side, and that is, how do we become responsible corporate citizens? And it's not only about being involved in labor issues and macro politics issues, but it's about leading the issues around food security. Now, the supermarket industry around the world has really been in the forefront of food security. If a supermarket wasn't open, people would starve today. They're not growing their own food. Nobody else is getting food to them. So it's a key resource in the country, which generally isn't recognized by government. But we need to be there, and we need to look at the whole food chain going forward. And so we do a lot of work in that. The other area that we look at related to that is the whole issue about sustainability in terms of waste management, plastics, and how do we make our environment that much better. And that's a core value around which we spend a lot of time, along with trying to build and develop small-scale farmers, small-scale business people, so that they can maybe do what we did one day. We were a small business, and how can we make other small businesses sustainable, growing, and employing lots of people? Food waste is one of the most critical issues as an industry that we're facing. Apart from the social impact of poverty and people starving and food being thrown away. It is just a waste of resource. In Southern Africa and Africa, we've estimated that about 60% of all food that is produced is not consumed by humans. It ends up in some form of compost or animal food or something, and it's all around supply chain, cold chains, and those issues. The fact in Southern Africa that we have a SADC and we have customs union doesn't mean that border controls work well. So you can find a truck sitting 5-6 days on a border between Johannesburg and Zimbabwe, and food spoiling, and works both ways. And one of the key challenges that we're facing and we're working with government on is to try and improve border controls. By doing so, you can actually improve food moving down, reduce spoilage, reduce wastage. If you were to take food wastage down by half, you would basically get away with a lot of hunger in the world. But also the huge impact that it has on spoiled food in terms of methane, and the impact that it has on the ozone layer and on climate change, the amount of food miles, that you would cut in terms of trucks moving product around. But there is a flip side, we've seen it as well. We've had a huge focus on getting the wastage down in our business. The negative flip side to it is that the food bank people have come to us and said, why aren't you supporting us so much anymore? Because we're not giving them as much food as we used to. So how do you balance that off? You obviously then give them a little bit more money. But the challenge is, how do you balance it? And it comes back to a systems approach. And if you don't actually look at all the unintended consequences of everything that's going on, you're actually going to fix one problem, but you're actually going to create another problem at the same time. And I think that's a problem that we're facing a lot with environment, the environmental issues. A small example around that is plastics. Now, we've seen a huge push to get plastic packaging growing around the world, and the real challenge now facing the industry is, how do you reduce plastic in the whole supply chain? But you've got to look at it differently, and that is, there's been a big drive for electric cars to get motor cars off the road. And what are the oil companies going to do with their oil? So oil consumption for vehicles is going down. They've got to do something else with them, so they're growing their big plastic business, which they're then selling into food packaging. So we've got to actually all work together as an environment to say, how do we deal with this as a holistic? And these are the challenges that are facing us. So it's not a retail issue, it's a societal issue, and the whole business eco-chain issue that we have to deal with. And those are the challenges that we try to deal with at both a multilateral level and at a local level and at a business-wide level in South Africa. I think the problem that's been facing South African business political relationships in the past couple of years has been largely that we've operated in our own individual spheres. Business, in my view, has tried to engage with government on a number of occasions and through a number of formats. And I don't think it's been successful. And it's not been successful because of a lack of trying and will from business, but there just hasn't been an interest from government. And I think one of the real problems we face as a country is that we have to not see business as the enemy. Business is what creates growth, business is what creates taxes, business is what creates jobs. We cannot rely on government to just keep creating jobs, because that's a recipe to nowhere. We've got to get people working. And to do that, government and business have to work together. One of the primary problems over the last couple of years has been the absolute lack of policy and policy implementation, with the different departments not knowing what they're doing. I think there are far too many government departments, too many ministers, and they need to shrink things down, need to become more efficient, and need to engage with stakeholders more efficiently and more effectively before rather than after the event. And I think if the political body in South Africa can actually take into account that it's not only about politics and their political parties, but it's about how do they make the pie bigger rather than how do they cut up a shrinking pie, I think we're going to get some change. And I think that is the real challenge that I see facing us over the next couple of years. I think you have to look at what my long-term philosophy, business leadership philosophy is. And I believe as the business leader, you go out and you employ the best possible experts you can to be experts in specific areas within your business. And the role of the overall leader is to lead, not to do. You've got to keep your hands in, you've got to understand the business, you've got to manage by walking around, you've got to be well in touch with what's happening. But the issue is, how do you look at the big picture all the time and take that big picture and make it relevant to your specific business? And I remember I was given a card when I must have been about 17 or 18. And I think it was a quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson where he said, "Do not follow where the path may lead, rather go where there's no path and leave a trail." And I think that is, as a leader, and particularly in business, what you need to do. You need to set the path, you need to set the direction for which other people can follow. If you're just following somebody else's path, you're always going to be playing catch up and you're not going to get ahead. And I think that's been one of the success points of Pick n Pay, and that was what my father did when he built Pick n Pay. And that's what I try to do, is to actually set a new direction and actually move onto that new direction.